Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to a dear friend and former colleague, Molly, and new friend, and maybe someday colleague, Benafsha, and let y'all take it from here.
Thank you so much. Well, good morning, everyone. Benafsha and I are very excited to be here. We are quite passionate about this subject as we're learning to navigate it in our current work. So just first, welcome. We're excited. Please use the chat as much as you would like. We will all be monitoring it, but please drop in thoughts, questions. We have a lot to cover, and I know 2 hours feels like a long time, but it's a short amount of time for the subject. So we'll be moving pretty fast. However, we will stop and answer questions if need be, or we'll just kind of save them at the end. So Benafsha, do you want to start sharing? And then we can talk about, so the title of this is Intersection of Immigrants and the Child Welfare System. And then our agenda for today is we're really going to start out very briefly talking about, honestly, Benafsha and I are going to talk a little bit about ourselves. We'll talk a brief overview of YWCA services, just so you all know kind of what we're doing currently in the work. We're going to have some ground rules because this is a bit of this can be a heated conversation. I don't think it will be today, but it can be, it's around the child welfare system. It's around mandated reporting. So it can trigger some intense feelings for people. And then we're going to go over relevant terminology around immigrants and refugees. And we're going to do actually 2 case studies, but we're going to do a case study and discussion, and then dive into some more intense, like what does it look like in practice with the immigrant and child welfare system. And we're going to end with another case study and questions. So let's start with our ground rules. This is kind of like, we're just going to walk into this saying, okay, we are open. And so we're going to demonstrate a growth mindset. And this is for like Benafsha and I as well. Like, we are learning. We do not know everything. We are not set in what we believe. Everything really that we experience informs then how we view the world. So we're going to demonstrate a growth mindset, lead with curiosity. So instead of just why, maybe think through like, oh, that's really interesting. Like that hits me differently. That lands really weird, but I'm going to approach it with curiosity instead of jumping to assumptions. Lean into your discomfort. So this can be an uncomfortable conversation. Lean into that discomfort. Obviously, if you are feeling like you need to take a break, that this is triggering you in certain ways, take a break. Do not make yourself, do not allow yourself to stay in a place that feels unsafe. I am very messy. Benafsha is less messy than I am. She's much more organized. But allow yourself to be messy if that's who you are. Allow yourself to make mistakes. There's no judgment around questions. That's why we're here. And then I just want to acknowledge, for me, as I speak, I have an intention of what I'm saying, and it may impact you negatively. It may impact you positively. Let's hope that's the case. But my intent today is good. But I also recognize that that might not land great for some people. When we talk, this is very important, obviously, for social workers, for anyone in the mental health profession, but confidentiality is key. So when we're talking about, when we're in our small group discussions, talking about things, please make sure to share the plot, not the characters. So de-identify whatever you're talking about. This I really love because, again, like Benafsha and I have a perspective. We are not experts. We are constantly learning, right? So no one knows everything. Everyone knows something. Together, we know a lot. So together, we will help each other learn more, push each other towards more knowledge and growth. And then again, this is a quick presentation for a big subject. So accept and expect a lack of closure. We will talk through as much as we can. We'll try to get through everything we have prepared, but it will not be everything that all of your expectations for this presentation, and that's okay. And then Benafsha and I will just introduce ourselves briefly so you know who we are and why we're talking about this. I am currently our Senior Director of Immigrant and Refugee Services at the YWCA Tulsa. We'll talk in a second just briefly about those services. I'm also community faculty at OU, so I teach in the social work department, mostly around tribal policy, macro social work, sexual violence, things like that. And then I was lucky enough to study in Central America, to work in places like Ghana and Mexico and Ecuador before moving back to the States. So I felt very welcomed in those communities with lots of love and patience for language and culture. So I feel like it's my honor and my responsibility to work towards creating more inclusive, welcoming, equitable communities for our immigrant and refugee folks here in Tulsa. And so it's a really neat opportunity to be able to do that in the work that Benafsha and I get to do. And then for today, I want to highlight that my work, especially around when it comes to child welfare, is informed by my social work background, my social work ethics, but it's also informed by my heritage. So my great-grandma was an Indian boarding school survivor. So she was forcibly separated from her family and taken from her home in North Tulsa at the age of 13. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the time was on a rampage to separate Native children from their parents in order to assimilate them into really white Christian culture. So there was a phrase that was used often, which was kill the Indian, save the man. And so that was what happened. So my grandma was placed in a school in central Oklahoma that, if anyone has family in boarding schools, probably that's where they went in Oklahoma. And she was beaten if she spoke Cherokee. She lost most of the language because of that. She was stripped of her culture and ended up running away twice, which I'm very proud of. But she survived, but she came out really scathed, honestly. And so I'm proud of her. I'm proud of my feisty boarding school survivor grandma, but I recognize the trauma of that separation. So that trauma of separation from child, from parent, has weighed incredibly heavy on my family, with generational trauma, honestly echoing in like everything we do. So my grandma ended up with substance use issues and often very violent, intimate relationships. And then ended up having strained relationships with her children because she didn't know how to bond with them in a healthy way. So because of this family history, I also highly value decolonizing the work we do, which often just means thinking more critically about why we do what we do, and how our work affects communities on the margins, and how we can use our power and privilege as professionals, right? All of us in this setting, to step back and create space for communities that are directly affected by these types of policies. So I will pass it off to Benafsha to share a little bit about herself and her experience.
Thank you, Molly. Thank you for sharing your story as well. So I'm Benafsha Tasmim. I'm the Director of Case Management and Workforce Services at YWCA Tulsa. As a refugee myself, I moved to the United States 10 years ago. So since then, I've been involved with the refugee, immigrant, and refugee communities at different capacities. So I not only have like personal experience as a refugee, but also working with the communities. And I also had the privilege of working with Oklahoma foster care system through a program where we helped young people in foster care system transition successfully into adulthood. So that kind of gave me a perspective about the child welfare system as well. So given all that background, I feel like my role is to promote understanding and bring cultural sensitivity and a meaningful change while working with the immigrant and refugee communities.
Wonderful. Well, very quickly, our mission at YWCA is a very heavy one. We are dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. And we use this mission in our day-to-day work. We are reminded of it, we talk about it, and it is really like what we focus on. So it informs what we do. In our immigrant and refugee services. So if you know about YWCA, you may know about immigrant and refugee services. You may know about us as gyms. And we've got very nice gyms also, but a big part of our work is our immigrant and refugee services. And so we have multiple programs within that. Our largest is our case management department that Benafsha runs. And this includes mostly working with recently arrived refugees for the first 5 years in the United States, helping them learn how to survive and then eventually how to thrive in our community. We also provide legal services, again, a lot around refugees, adjustment of status, family-based petitions. And then we also have a partnership with DIVIS, where we have an attorney taking cases for immigrant survivors of sexual violence. And then we have community connections. Basically, like we're always out in the community. We're attempting to take what we learn in this work to help inform other agencies and other social workers and other professionals, just like we're doing right now. We have youth education that's under our education department, and our youth education is like so fun. They run like a youth mentoring program. And so it's a lot of refugees working with refugees, which is really neat. So it's young adults who are mentoring youth. And that can look like helping with English, helping with homework, or we've got like a soccer team who have joined a league right now, and they're on a soccer team together and they're doing awesome. They're called the Afghan Stars, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's pretty cool. And then they do like an art camp. They're just doing lots of fun stuff to help youth, particularly youth who have arrived in the last couple of years, just have someone to like lean on and learn from. Because you think about the people in our lives who we were able to rely on to teach us things like how to drive, how to talk to someone that we were interested in, all those sort of things that honestly new communities don't necessarily have yet. So it's a really cool program. And then we have adult education, which is focused on English language, citizenship classes, helping people pass their citizenship test. And then we also have digital skills classes, mostly focused on helping people obtain better employment. And then lastly, we have our interpretation and translation department. And this is open to anyone who needs interpretation or translation in Oklahoma. So if you are working for an agency that is often struggling to find an interpreter for a language like Somi, Dari, Pashto, Mandarin, we have interpreters who are from the communities, who are native speakers in about 15 different languages. And then we can also provide translation for that as well. So if you have any interest, you're welcome to send me an email, which I will provide at the end. But we love helping create language access for folks all across Oklahoma. And that's a pretty brief description. I'll pass it off to Benafsha to talk about terminology.
I'll just talk about like few specific terminologies that may come up as we're talking, so you know the different groups that we're talking about. So immigrant, a lot of you may already know, child or adult living in the United States who were born outside the country. Refugee, on the other hand, child or immigrants who are fleeing persecution or has been admitted in the country due to special humanitarian reasons. So basically, as the name sounds like, they're seeking refuge in the US. Naturalized citizen are the adult or children who went through the process and met the requirement, and now they're citizens. Undocumented immigrants, child or adult living in the United States who was born outside the United States, but they do not have proper authorization or documentation to live in the United States. And then one more, unaccompanied migrants. Those are children or youth under the age of 18 who were born outside the United States, and they have not lawfully, or like they don't have documentation, or they may have documentation and they have entered the United States, but the big thing for this is they're without a parent or guardian. So these are some of the terminologies that may come across as we're talking about these things.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to take kind of like a moment to center ourselves in this conversation, to think about, to center ourselves. So this is going to be a quick thought exercise. Bear with me. I'm going to have you close your eyes for a minute. You can turn off the screen if you want to, if you feel uncomfortable, but close your eyes. And I want you to imagine that war broke out in your neighborhood. It might be really hard to picture this. However, if you are in Eastern Oklahoma, you can start with picturing kind of, what does it look like after a big storm? What does devastation look like? So war has broken out suddenly, out of nowhere. And you know that you have to leave quickly. It's not safe where you are. Your roommates, your family members, your children, they're all shocked, just as shocked and terrified as you are. Think about what that might look like. What do you feel now in your body? Now you know you have to leave. Do you feel it in your shoulders? Do you feel your shoulders moving up? Do you feel your stomach drop? You find out you've got 5 minutes to leave and you only have one bag you can take with you. There's not room for anything more. What would you take? Now, what do you feel in your body? Okay, I'm gonna have you open your eyes. We're gonna take a deep breath in and out. And in a couple words, if you can drop in the chat box, just drop a couple words that come to mind. Either what you were feeling in your body, your reaction to that. Yes, anxiety, confusion. What is going on? Yeah, terror. Absolutely. Fear and anxiety, chaotic. Yes. Can you imagine? I think that's such a good word to describe. Can you imagine the chaos of it? So you're feeling anxiety, your family's having fear and panic and feeling destabilized. It is chaos. Dread, loss. Yes. You can already feel a sense of loss. So we're going to hold on. I know that these feelings are heavy and hard. We're going to hold on to those feelings, though. We're going to keep them in mind during this presentation, because it's going to inform how we view the people we're talking about, the scenarios we're going to bring up. So keep in mind all of what you felt in your body and your mind. And we are actually going to move into a case study. So we're going to take this moment. We're going to move into a case study where, nope, first we're going to talk about statistics. So I will give you a second before we move into the case study. Okay, so keep that with you in mind. So you have this feeling. That is the feeling that so many people have experienced who are living next door to you, who are your clients, who are yourself, who are your family members. The US in particular has really high numbers of global migrants. So the US has close to 20% of all global migrants and refugees in the world. It still only represents a very small percentage of our population, though. So we have a large country, a lot of space. It only represents 5% of the world's population. So we're taking in a lot of people, but it's really not a large number on the grand scheme of it. There are approximately 45.3 million immigrants in the US. And what we want to stress today is immigrant and refugee families may encounter and will encounter child welfare system following any type of report around child maltreatment, anything like that. They're going to have the same needs as other families, but what the difference is they're going to have very unique challenges. So challenges as they attempt to navigate the welfare system and as the welfare system attempts to understand them or makes assumptions about who they are. So there are, and we'll talk about them today, but there are certain policies and practices that we believe agencies can implement to best serve these populations, and we will talk through all of that in the second hour. But first, we want to just do an initial case study where we talk about, where we throw out all of our assumptions, okay? And we discuss them and we interrogate this case study and this family that we're bringing up. So
I'll share it. I'll drop it in the chat.
So we have a PDF. If you can pull it up in the chat when Benafsha drops it, we'll give a few minutes. We'll give like 5 minutes to read it. And then we're going to put you in breakout rooms. There are discussion questions at the end of the PDF. And so we're going to give you 5 minutes to read this. Of course, if you need to read it multiple times or you don't get through it, that's okay. And then we'll do a breakout room for about 10 minutes, and then we'll come back to discuss. So it sounds like you all had some good discussions. So let's just very quickly, we'll just do a group discussion around your thoughts and what you all talked about in your smaller groups. So based on the information you all received from the neighbor, from the family, and the interaction with the child welfare specialist, what are your initial concerns about this family, if you have any? And you can unmute or put things in the chat, whatever you feel most comfortable with.
Well, my first concern is they need a lot of services.
Yep.
And it's gonna be like an onion. You gotta gradually peel it away because you have so much going on in that household. And the specialist needs to be culturally aware, so that they don't just readily remove these children, because the way other people live in other countries, it might be okay for the kids to be running around, because there's not a big concern for abduction or that type of thing, where here in America, that's a big concern. So we can't just rush to judgment. I would be concerned about the adult men that the girls are around, because as we know what happens in lots of situations. So I would try to
what
figure out.
questions do you ask about that?
I would ask, do they know these men? You know, are they related to these men? And why do they allow the girls to play around these men?
Yeah, so you would start to dig in a little bit more about, like, okay, so it sounds like they're spending time with older men. What does that mean? Right. Yeah, so you'd get more information from them, honestly. Yeah.
Because of everything, that is my biggest concern. I think because we don't need to add another element to whatever is going on in this household already. I would also ask the mother about prenatal care, because she's pregnant. Has she had any medical care for her pregnancy? So, you know, that's important.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. And do they have any other family around or friends that they can get some support from?
What other concerns, if you have any, other folks? Or do you suspect neglect or abuse?
This is Priscilla. I didn't suspect neglect or abuse. I felt like it was more of a time to ask more questions and to look a little deeper. I didn't see safety issues that sprung up. I understand talking to the two males, but not knowing who the two males are is a reason why you have to ask more questions. The not having electricity, that's a poverty issue, and people cope with not having electricity. They know how to do things. We just went through our little Tulsa thing. People coped. Nobody was coming over and removing kids because, and if you are living in that situation for a long duration, you normally know how to handle that situation. I'm trying to think of the third thing that was kind of brought out, but the kids running around, that is, again, the way parents raise their children, and those are conversations. And anytime you walk into this family's home, or you're invited into another cultural's home or something you're not as familiar, you have to check your biases at the door. You have to be more open and willing to learn something. And the pregnancy thing, people in other cultures don't use doctors like we do. They have midwives, they have community. She had 2 other kids. It is not uncommon for people in other cultures not to use medical services when they're pregnant. they have a way in which they deal with pregnancy and more information about that. The nonverbal communication, that again, she may be communicating other ways. There are lots of ways to communicate nonverbally. So those were some things I saw flags, but I didn't see concerns. I saw places to ask more clarification.
Thank you. I know we all have people had a lot of thoughts on this. I think Benafsha and I are particularly, we want to kind of like share a little bit. So this is from, I mean, some of it's made up, but most of it is based off of something that did happen with one of our clients. And so what we wrote down in this case study is basically what happened. So what was reported to us, what was reported to DHS, what DHS gathered, and then we want to share kind of like the rest of the story. So like when we started asking more questions, when we brought a cultural understanding to the situation, all these sort of like concerns for us kind of drifted away. So first, I want to mention, so the children are running around in the complex unsupervised. That is okay. So like, that's also like a cultural thing. It's also, if you've lived in an apartment complex, you know that that's just like what kids do. Like, that's how they are able to like spend time outside, right? It's healthier sometimes. Yes, there's safety concerns for any kid outside unsupervised, but not really a red flag for abuse or neglect. I love that this was brought up around the little 4-year-old spending time with 2 adult men. So when this was brought to me, I was like, ooh, interesting. And I talked to Benafsha about it, and we dug in because the assumption was immediately made by the neighbor or by the community member that it was trafficking. So it was like a leap from a 4-year-old spending unsupervised time with adult men to the parents are allowing trafficking. This was the little girl's uncles who had left Afghanistan without their families. And so this was their connection to their own children, was being able to, and they lived together, right? They all kind of lived in the same apartment complex, kind of replicating the community living. And so it was really normal. Also, Benafsha, you can speak more to this, but like, it's less weird in Afghanistan for like, honestly, like adult men are much more like engaged and from what I've seen as well, and like love on kids, and it's not inappropriate. It's part of having like a more communal culture. It says the mom is nonverbal with multiple TBIs. This was reported to DHS. Whenever I spoke with the child welfare specialist, I said, does she have TBIs? And the welfare specialist said, well, that's what was reported to me. Let's look through the medical information. She looked through the medical information and she's like, it's nowhere in the medical information. So it was, again, like an assumption made because she was nonverbal with the neighbor. And because she is legitimately like a little bit slower to respond to things. It turns out that, I think we put this in there, with the interpreter, when she was, not as verbal, not really responding to things, she struggled with the questions. The interpreter was interpreting the wrong language. Well, the language that they spoke, but not the mom's language. So the mom wasn't fully understanding even the questions that were being asked of her. So when she struggled to respond about family, about medical needs, that was all language. And then Benafsha, do you want to tell a little bit about kind of like disclosing pregnancy and why that might have been,
So that goes back to the cultural aspect, and the same like Molly mentioned, like childbearing, it's in different cultures, it's a communal thing. So the whole community takes responsibility for the kid instead of where the US culture is, it's mom and dad who are responsible. So it's very normal for uncles to take care of like their nieces and nephews. And then in terms of pregnancy, and we had to face that in the beginning to actually learn that, there's this culture of keeping it private until the baby is delivered because it's considered indecent if you announce that you're pregnant. And they only announce it to their very close family members like mom or like aunts and uncles, but not announce it to everyone. You might see in some immigrants or refugees coming from those cultures where when they get pregnant, they wear like really baggy clothes and wrap themselves in a big cloth so to cover that, so they don't announce that as opposed to like where we have in the US, it's a very common thing and you announce it, it's a celebration, and they also celebrate it but in a different way.
Yeah. So we're going to share, I think the next slide is, we're going to share kind of like what we got from the community member who reached out to us and then also made the DHS report.
Wait, I asked
one
more question because I found this fascinating when you shared previously about the dates of birth.
Oh, the birth dates. Yes. Can I share I will share like what happened, and then I'll share, Benafsha can share like culturally what it is. So whenever she didn't know all of the birth dates of her children. Mm-hmm. That is like bonkers, right? That's wild here in the US to not know your children's. Like that's like does not happen. So whenever we were first doing like intakes with particularly Afghan clients, and Jeannie's nodding her head because she remembers, there was like one day where we were doing like so many every day. So one morning someone comes in and I say, what's your birth date? They say 1/1/87. And I was like, oh, wow, New Year's baby. That's cool. And they were like, okay. And then I was like, all right, I guess they don't, they're tired of that. And then someone else comes, like an hour later, someone comes in and says 1/1/74. And I was like, I just met someone else who has the same birth date as you. That is crazy. And they also were like, okay. Then by the time the third person told me that their birth date was 1/1, a specific year, I realized that something was going on that I was not understanding. So I didn't congratulate them on being a New Year's baby, and instead asked one of our Afghan interpreters, what's going on here? So Benafsha, do you want to explain what's going on here?
Yeah, so in Afghanistan, date of birth is not a significant thing. A lot of people don't know their date of birth or how old they are because it's just not important. Some people, when they move to the capital, Kabul, when they need like some specific documentation, they would go and get like documentation. But other than that, they never need date of birth. So there's a running joke where they're usually the way in the US we have Christmas, so it happens every year. And Afghan culture, Muslim culture, they have Eid. So like Christmas, they have Eid, but it happens twice a year. So the joke is the kid asked the mom, like, when was I born? They're like, oh, you were born before the small Eid. And there's Eid every year. So they never know exactly what date. It's just very normal. It's very common.
Which is just truly, I mean, from an American perspective, that is one of the most fascinating things that I've learned. And just such an easy, I mean, obviously, that is an assumption that most Americans would make if they find that someone doesn't know their own birthday. They may say, oh, they have a TBI, or that they don't know their children's birthday. Oh, they're neglectful. And I mean, you never know, right? You never know what's going on in someone else's culture or family. So this was the text we received, and Benafsha and I, we were like, we're going to share this because this is the kind of information that we get in our work. Again, from a concerned community member who is well-intentioned, very well-intentioned, but this was her response to this situation. I'll read it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I don't consider myself an alarmist, but can you think of any legitimate reason for a small female child to be taken to the apartment of 3 single men, not to mention the man she's sometimes left alone with who lives in another apartment complex, other than trafficking? The mom is always at home unless she has a doctor's appointment, and they have other family in the apartment complex, including 2 aunts, who are always at home too, unless they're at the doctor. So there would never be a need for 3 single men to take care of this child. There's a little bit of humor in this of, I don't consider myself an alarmist. But this is the perspective of a lot of folks who really want to support and protect vulnerable populations. But this in particular led to a very, very stressful, difficult situation for the family, because it was this kind of report that went to DHS. Thankfully, we got involved and we were able to figure out, like Sharon mentioned at the beginning, this family needed support. This family needed support at a lot of services, and we were able to step in and say, okay, what kind of services does this family need? It's not around TBI, it's not around trafficking, but it is around better paying jobs, getting them connected to, you know, LIHEAP, getting them connected to other mental health services. But it wasn't what was assumed at the very beginning. Any questions about this? We're about to take like a little break and go into the second part, but I know we've gone through, this case study has a lot. So if anyone has any additional questions or like, what was this about? You can take a couple minutes. Okay, we will take a 5-minute break. We'll come back at 11:10. And we will do the last half of the, go ahead and move. We're going to move into the second part of our training, and I'm going to pass it off to Benafsha.
Thank you. So as Molly went through the stats, some of the statistics, how overrepresented immigrant and refugees are in the child welfare system. Generally speaking, research shows that all BIPOC families, so all families of color, are likely to be reported to child welfare agencies. And once involved with the child welfare system, they're more likely to experience harsher interventions and consequences, such as removal from their of their children from their homes, and compared to their white counterparts. But there are some specific factors that contribute to the immigrant and refugees over representation in the system. As we talked before, language is a big barrier. So immigrant families or refugee families are most likely to be non-native English speakers, and they may face challenges communicating with the child welfare workers or understanding their legal rights or being able to advocate for themselves. The case study we just shared and we discussed, the language was a big barrier. Like, even though they did have an interpreter, the interpreter did not speak the same dialect of the language that they were speaking. So there were a lot of misunderstandings that dragged along this case for a long time. Cultural differences is another one. So as we talked about different differences, refugees and immigrants are most likely to come from different values and different belief system. So for example, immigrant families may have a different way of disciplining their kids. So for example, physical discipline may be an unacceptable form of punishment for them, whereas in the child welfare policies in the United States, it's prohibited. So it's more, goes back to education because the culture is different. And then the poverty. So immigrant families are more likely to have to live in poverty and lack access to basic resources like housing, healthcare, education, and this can put them at a greater risk for child welfare involvement. The other one that I don't think anyone will be surprised to hear, implicit bias and racism among child welfare workers and others involved in the child welfare system. So it can be implicit or explicit, but in general, BIPOC families are more likely to be viewed through a lens of suspicion, even though in many cases, there are no evidence of abuse or neglect. So as you know, like there is a need for change to decrease this number. What we want to talk about is the mandated reporting. So mandated reporting basically is when you see something, when you have a suspicion, you have to call the child welfare system if you think that this kid is in danger of abuse or neglect. In recent years, child welfare has supposedly shifted its focus to implementing preventative supports, which means you have to call the child welfare agency when you suspect something, as opposed to reactionary practices. In result, the rate at which children are being removed from their families and their caregivers have increased significantly in the recent years. So mandated reporting laws were created to prevent child abuse and neglect, but there's no evidence to support that. We continue to see increase in maltreatment reports, and then it has been increasing in the recent years, especially after the pandemic. So rethinking how we engage with mandated reporting can help reduce the harmful outcomes of these reporting guidelines. But I have to say there may be times that immediate safety of the child requires reporting the family to the child welfare system. That's not denied, but we just have to rethink about it, how we do it. So let's talk about the training that's being done on mandated reporting. So mandated reporting trainings often focus on how to report. It primarily emphasizes the legal consequences of not reporting, and it discusses the risks and the safety risk if someone doesn't report an incident or an assumption. The training assumes that it is always the safest option, and it overlooks the harmful consequences and also the historical trauma that comes with it. The mantra is, when in doubt, report. So this is commonly taught without addressing the trauma, the increased risk of family separation, cultural and parenting norms, or like alternative responses, providing resources. So also, like, let's talk about the legal aspect. So the legal threshold for mandated reporting relies on a vague language. So they call it reasonable belief. If you have reasonable belief, you have to report it. Whereas they don't define reasonable belief. What is reasonable belief? Even if they do define it in some instances, mandated reporters oftentimes are community members and they don't understand the legal in-depth and understanding of the legal aspect of what is reasonable belief. So again, rethinking how we engage with mandated reporting. When we think about that, we come closer to ending harmful outcomes for family separation. We have another case study that Dijon will share in the chat. So what we will do, we will give you all like 5 minutes, or you can, once you finish reading the case study, send a thumbs up. And then we will send you into breakout rooms again, so you can discuss for like 10 to 15 minutes. And then we will come back to the big room and we will do a debrief of our discussions.
Okay, so the case study is Rethinking Mandated Reporting. Background. In a case brought to the attention of social service agency staff, 2 concerned clients reported their belief that a 5-year-old child was being harmed by siblings and parents. They observed a cut on the child's wrist and witnessed the parents disciplining the child in a way that made them feel uncomfortable. The situation was shared with the staff, leading to the involvement of a caseworker who reviewed their case notes. The notes revealed that the child's mother was experiencing issues with the father, particularly conflicts over sending money back to Afghanistan. The case notes also mentioned the mother expressing feelings of not wanting to live, although she later confirmed that those thoughts no longer persisted. The initial response in Rethinking of Mandated Reporting. Given the potential domestic violence situation and the potential danger to the child, there was an initial inclination to make a report to DHS. However, the staff recognized the importance of exploring the situation further before taking such action. They understood the complexity of the case and the need to consider alternative approaches that would better address the underlying issues. To gain a comprehensive understanding of the situation, the staff implemented several actions before proceeding with the DHS report. First, they promptly arranged for caseworkers to conduct a home visit to assess the household environment. Additionally, they invited the mother to the office for a meeting, providing a safe space for her to share her experiences and concerns about potential domestic violence. The outcome of these proactive measures significantly differed from the initial assumptions. During the meeting, the mother, along with other family members, revealed a traumatic experience during their departure from their home country. The family recounted an incident where one of their cousins was shot as they were fleeing. The 5-year-old child had witnessed this horrifying event, resulting in behavioral issues and self-harm tendencies. To ensure the child's safety, the family had resorted to locking away potential objects of harm. The mother expressed her concerns about the ongoing conflict at home, exacerbated by the financial strain of supporting both their current household and family members still in hiding from the Taliban in Afghanistan. The mother was not aware of mental health services that could help her child, as these kind of services simply do not exist in her home country. So upon learning those details, the staff swiftly reconsidered their plan to report the case to DHS. Instead, they immediately connected the 5-year-old child with mental health support services to address the trauma and self-harm tendencies. Simultaneously, the caseworkers began exploring opportunities to secure employment for the mother and seeking additional resources to alleviate the family's financial struggles. In conclusion, the case study exemplifies the importance of rethinking mandated reporting when working at the intersection of immigrants, refugees, and the child welfare system. By taking additional steps to gather insights, the staff gained a deeper understanding of the family's traumatic experiences and the resulting challenges that they faced because of them. This understanding led to a more nuanced and compassionate response focused on providing tailored support and resources rather than solely relying on mandatory reporting. The case underscores the significance of cultural sensitivity, trauma-informed practices, and comprehensive assessments when addressing the complex needs of immigrant and refugee families in the child welfare system. All right, welcome back. Let's discuss. So what are your initial thoughts and reactions to the discussion that Benafsha gave on rethinking mandated reporting within your context or within the context of this case study? Again, you can unmute. Yep, go ahead. Oh, you can unmute or you can drop it in the chat box. Either is great. And I'm known to wait it out, so I will wait it out. But any initial thoughts to rethinking mandated reporting through the lens that Benafsha gave? Yeah, how does that look? What does that look like in your work? What's scary about it?
So I'm actually this reminds me of something that actually Dijon told me when I first started working with her at Divis. Long time ago before the pandemic, and I don't know if it was specifically to me or if it was in a meeting, but I remember it, talking about reporting, whether it was made you uncomfortable or if it was actually abuse or neglect. Because, in the context of the shelter at Divis, those two are sometimes hard to separate. Yeah. And so I think that is always a challenge, but then when you add the trauma and all the cultural differences on top of it, that makes it even more complicated. But it's important to keep it in mind because there can be very real consequences, negative consequences to making a DHS report. And also at the same time, there can be consequences for you if you don't.
Yes.
So it's a hard line to walk because there's consequences on both sides. So it's not a simple decision, I don't think really ever, except for in a few cases where it's an obvious one.
I mean, I think that's exactly it, is there are very few times in like your career where you'll have just such an obvious one. I mean, hopefully, right? But most of it is trying to figure out how to walk that line, because we know making a call or not making a call affects someone's life drastically. And so it's a really heavy place to be. It's a heavy responsibility, which is why obviously like we want to bring in a little bit of like the slowing down and stopping to be curious and ask more questions. But it is scary. I mean, during this case in particular, I was like, all right, everybody, let's get together. And it was, and like my guidance was to slow down, but I was also like, but it's also super scary when you have a 5-year-old who we assumed was self-harming. I was like, there's something else going on. And having Divis background, my assumption was domestic violence. Turns out it was like, that was only slightly true. But it's exactly that. It's just it's a heavy responsibility what we all have. So thank you for sharing that. I love the uncomfortable versus unsafe. Yeah. It's also good to see you. Other initial thoughts? Okay, here's a direct one. What are the consequences? What are some possible consequences of reporting this family here in this case study to DHS? Consequences, positive or negative?
I have to be transparent again.
Mm-hmm.
So my history is I was a child welfare supervisor for 9 years before coming to legal aid. I only left child welfare because the program was about family defense. One of the reasons I joined legal aid, joined DHS, was because it was the time of the Pinnacle Plan. We were changing everything. We're going to do this and we're going to be more parent friendly. When kids come into custody and that legal piece is put in there, unless there is just early evidence of it being different from whatever is reported, the short stay is 6 months of those kids in custody. The average stay is over 2 years. If they're reunified with their family. So I know these things. That's why I walk this line very cautiously. The reunification rate in Tulsa, in Oklahoma itself, really sucks. Of families actually being put back together. We have a lot of resources and all of that, but once you get into that system, there's a lot of bias, a lot of opinions that come into play, and it's hard to unravel that. And you'll have children who want to go home and that option isn't available to them because whatever is put out there. So, I mean, the reality of every system is broken, yet every system needs to feed itself in order to stay alive. So the ones that are targeted are certain zip codes, certain ways that you interact with the general public. So we have to be aware of our biases, and we have to be aware of the reality of when we are doing this. A lot of times my workers that I first would work with came into it to rescue children. Well, I would have to address the thing that we are here to help families. And I caution everyone that when you're dealing with DHS, you remind them of their mission. Find out what their mission statement is, because it is not about rescuing children. It's about helping families. And when we're helping families, that doesn't always mean removal is the first thing and it also means that they have so many services and other ways to approach an issue, but it's not easy. It's so much simpler to remove a family and put the kids where they think the kids are safe.
And I'll tell you, yeah. I mean, I think that's part of the, I mean, I put a quote that you just said, which I think is just brilliant, which is every system must feed itself to stay alive. Ugh, it's so good. I will say in the first case study that we talked about, the family who, the mother might have a TBI, the kids are going to this man's house. What was really incredible, I thought, was like that when DHS was involved, they did take a step back. They said, we've never worked with an Afghan family before. Let's figure out, let's slow this down, because that train was going fast towards assumptions. And the caseworker told me specifically, I am not interested in removing these children. I will do everything I can to prevent that from happening. And so she did the hard work, which required a lot of slowing down. She pushed back against her supervisor, who was like, you need to close this case one way or another, or, make a decision. But she slowed down. She created coordinated response teams. We were able to bring in the mosque and our caseworkers and people who knew the family. And it shed such a different light on the situation. And then the family got, honestly, the services they needed without being caught up in that system that you just mentioned that feeds itself. Because we knew as soon as they were in it, it was going to be just a nightmare to unravel and to get them out of it. So I think that's such a brilliant way of describing the larger system at play, and how it interacts with the individuals and the families that we're working with. We haven't named this, but what are some of, when you all are talking about this, I mean, we're talking about assumptions and we're talking about biases, but when we're looking at immigrants and refugees, what are some of the particular biases that are coming up? So the assumption that an Afghan man is trafficking, where is that coming from? Racism, right? Yeah. Racism, xenophobia, being scared of Muslims, being scared of someone who's different, has a different religion. And that is such a deep part of this discussion. When we are working with immigrants and refugees, they're not only facing, language access issues, barriers to getting transportation and safe housing, but they're also experiencing all these as visible minorities, right? As visible people on the margins, they are experiencing, yes, all of these stereotypes, which only heightens their risk of being involved in any system, in child welfare, criminal justice, all of it. What other thoughts do you all have, or questions? We can also open it up for questions or just general thoughts.
If I may?
Yeah, please.
I'm thinking a general thought is that the child welfare system as we understand it today is super, super white, and the lack of consideration of a harmful consequence for family separation is loss of culture. For white families that it's okay to just stick a person into another, slot, and that's fine. But to completely lose all access to your history, your language, your everything, that is so traumatizing. And we don't even consider the ways in which they are so much more re-traumatized than all other kiddos. All kiddos are traumatized by the system, but in particular, kiddos with a cultural difference. I was telling Laura in my breakout room, my partner, he's African-American, but he was adopted at 6 weeks by two middle-aged white people, and he has no access to being a Black man. And so sometimes we'll talk, and I'm like, I'm trying to tell him like what it's like, and he's just like, and I'm like, that's such a like that. What a thing that has happened, you know, to take someone like. But that's just a small example of, you know, like African Americans is different than if you were to take somebody from a family in Zimbabwe or South, you know, like it would just be different, and their experience should be recognized and should be extra attended to, which this caseworker did. So that's awesome.
That's a huge part of it. Thank you for bringing that up. Huge part is losing your identity. Like with all of this, losing like connection to anyone in that community. If you don't speak the language, whether it's like literal language or the language of the culture, like you're not in the inn. You're always trying to figure out, you know, what crowd you're a part of, where you connect, what's your community. It's deep. It is. And I think we know, like we talked about, there's higher rates if you are not white to be pulled into that system. And it's, again, those assumptions that the way that the culture interacts is somehow wrong because it's different. Oh, I love this. Keep everyone else. Keep.
All right. Should we move forward?
Yeah.
Okay. So you all mentioned, I feel like a lot of this is what we already talked about. As we mentioned, like reporters often rely on the first suspicion or that anxiety that you talked about. It makes them anxious. So they take that as like, oh, it's not safe. And that results in surveillance of families of color because it's different. So over half of Black families are being subjected to maltreatment reports, even when similar situations are happening in white families, for example. So the reliance on mandated reporting perpetuates the racial disparities and implicit bias within the system. And research also shows that removal of children from their homes, even for safety reasons, does not offer a significant benefit compared to remaining at home in terms of cognitive, academic, mental, and behavioral outcomes. In contrary, trauma-responsive strategies focused on collaboration, cultural attunement, sharing of power with the parent, and providing resources and giving voice and choice to the families are much more beneficial and effective. So what do you do before you make the call? Because there are instances that you do have to make the call. But what do you do to decrease the harm? First one is examine your relationship with this child and family. So social work theory points that the strength of a relationship we have with a person or a family is the single most influential factor in how successful we are in bringing intervention. So establish a trusting relationship with family and the kid's primary caregiver. Reflect on your own values, norms, and biases when assessing parenting practices. As American cultural norms tends to favor white parenting styles. And there are multiple safe ways to parent. Our cultural norms doesn't mean that this is the only way, the way white families do parenting is the safest way. There's many different ways of parenting. So I want to give an example that I read in one of the papers. There's the concept of free-range parenting. And the founder of the free-range parenting, Lenora Skenazy, she wanted to do an experiment. So what she did was she let her 9-year-old son go to school in New York subway. So she received a lot of backlash, and they were like, she shouldn't have done that. But on the other hand, she also had like a popular newspaper column. She had reality shows and television talks. So all of that happened. But she never had her child removed from her family. Compare this with an outcome of a South Carolina mother, Deborah Harrell, who in 2014, she allowed her 9-year-old daughter to play in a park, gave her a cell phone while she worked at a nearby McDonald's. So this was because she didn't have resources and she had to do it. Harrell, who was Black, was arrested for child abandonment and spent the night in jail. Her daughter spent 17 days in foster care. For Skenazy and other free-range parenting, people who have that philosophy, this parenting is not a necessity, so they didn't have any consequences. But for Harrell, she had different consequences. So does the risk change because of the intent? Because the intent of those two people were different. So the perception of risks are directly correlated with race and ethnicity, what we have been talking about. So these biases impact which families are initially reported and what consequences they face in the system. So think explicitly about race and culture. Ask yourself, is it truly about safety? I think a lot of you I heard mentioning this as well. It may seem like oversimplification, but ask yourself, would I be reporting this family if this family looked like mine or someone, my friend that I know? Employ a decision-making model. So consult at least one other person whose thinking is not based on when in doubt, report. They don't have that mindset. Consult them, see what they think. There's different thinking models that you can apply, but the main point is consult someone else instead of having a knee-jerk reaction and making that call. Be curious about what you're observing. Have challenging conversations. We encourage curiosity rather than judgment or having that anxiety because it's different from how you would do things. Sometimes reporters are genuinely concerned for a child and they mistake their own feelings of discomfort for risk and lack of safety. So examine these beliefs and biases. And then offer support and services. So there are more effective ways of supporting families than child welfare involvement that do not bring the same potential, that do not have the same potential and bring harm to the family. There are some guidelines when working with the refugee family, immigrant and refugee families. So these are guidelines if the child welfare is involved with the refugee families. So child welfare agencies should prioritize system level change to effectively work with immigrant and refugee families. So that means doing some training, ongoing training, engaging with the community, learning about the cultural practices, and then interagency collaboration with external entities such as foreign consulates, case management service providers, refugee service providers. They call them cultural brokers, so people who would facilitate understanding of different cultures, and also involving people who understand the laws and regulations of immigration and refugees. I want to focus specifically on refugee resettlement services. We are refugee resettlement services. We can really help with culturally responsive ways of engaging with those kind of situations. So we not only help with that, but we also can help families connect with resources, because a lot of time that may be the issue, and help also train the child welfare workers. A lot of time the refugee resettlement services do job shadowing. So a child welfare worker would shadow the job of a caseworker, for example, and learn, and then the caseworker does the same for the refugee resettlement, so for the child welfare. So they learn from each other. So it's more of collaboration. Foreign consulates, consult them if it's someone whose parents are not in the US. And then, as I talked about, cultural brokers, so people who serve as advocates working with immigrant and refugees. The other one is screening for immigration benefits. Sometimes when working with undocumented immigrants or unaccompanied immigrants, if we screen them for immigration services, they may qualify for citizenship, which in turn qualifies them to access more services. So there are different ways that the child welfare can collaborate with other agencies to better serve this community and to reduce harm. So I will pause at this moment and open the floor to any questions that you may have.
I want to thank you all for being so like engaging and being open to that growth mindset. All of your perspectives are just like, it was so wonderful to hear from you all. You clearly bring a lot of expertise and knowledge to the table.
And I would like to say a special thank you both to Molly and Benafsha for joining today, for sharing your expertise. This was amazing. Thank you. Thank you.